Hello.
Hi, Menno. How are you doing? Can you see me and hear me okay?
Yep. All looks good.
Very well. So, thank God I didn't screw up the time zone because we recently added an hour. That's what got me a little confused, but good to see you again. It's such a privilege and honor. Thanks for taking the time. I really
hmm
do appreciate it.
Daylight savings time is always a major problem because not only is it just something that everyone forgets about, but different regions have daylight savings time in different at different times, or they don't even incorporate it. And it actually has a lot of societal negative effects. More
Yeah,
people die the day after daylight savings times than on other days because of
actually,
traffic accidents and stuff.
yeah. I was actually checking some research about that. Research, I'm sorry about that because personally, it always hits me like I don't function really well with the change.
Yeah, you have basically an hour of jet lag.
Yeah, pretty much. So anyway, I don't want to take a lot of your time. I wanted to discuss with you training to failure and also advanced training techniques, especially for hypertrophy. I was actually
hmm
in the Five Stars Congress. It was great to see you. And I was remembering the last time we spoke a while back. I think you were in Brazil. And where are you currently living, Mano?
Portugal, Lisbon.
Portugal. Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Still on the digital nomad lifestyle, as I can see.
Yep. And even Portuguese countries.
Awesome, awesome. So anyway, training to failure. I wanted to discuss Mano because it's such a nuanced topic. What is failure in the research context? What is an RAR zero? What is momentary muscle failure? What is concentric, eccentric failure? And how can we make best sense of all these different types of failure to better apply it to hypertrophy training? And also in regards to hypertrophy training, the proximity to failure conversation on itself. So anyway, I know it's a lot it's a lot to unpack, but I wanted to begin with what does it actually mean failure? What is failure in the research?
There are a few different definitions of muscle failure that are in use. In research, most exercise scientists focus on the definition of momentary muscle failure. And I think that's sort of true failure in the sense that it's the physical inability to complete another repetition with good form. Some people, or what you often see in research, is that people talk about volitional failure. And I think it's very good to, well, there's someone at the door. Sorry, I have to get it.
Don't worry, don't worry.
Olá,
Olá.
tudo bem? Sorry, não.
Tem o trabalho.
Sim, é porque já finalizamos a limpeza.
Sim, bom.
É agora? Acertamos com o senhor o pagamento?
Tá.
Sorry, desculpe, não queria atrapalhar o trabalho. Tá bem, obrigada.
Yeah.
Boa tarde.
Flexing the Portuguese indeed.
So
Hi, Mano.
that was actually my
Don't worry, man.
my bad. I forgot to pay the cleaning
Don't
crew.
worry at all. People were saying you were flexing the Portuguese.
Well, my Portuguese is better than. Could you still hear that from there? Well, I can still hear you as well with the.
I can fine.
Mhm. Yeah, I could still hear you with the Bluetooth. Didn't think it would
Oh,
work. Anyway,
sure.
training to
Sure.
failure.
Right, right.
So the sort of true failure is momentary muscle failure. It's the actual inability to complete another repetition. Like if somebody put a gun to your head, you wouldn't be able to finish the rep. And volitional failure is more what people, I think, probably more commonly experience. And it's just, what gives out is not necessarily the muscle, but it's your will, your volition. So volitional failure is what is very often used in exercise science studies. When you tell people just do as many reps as you can, then researchers are now leaning much more towards saying that people had volitional failure. Because a lot of studies, they say, well, the people training to failure, and then they have these things like, oh, you have these 70-year-old women that had never lifted before, and they did 4 sets of 10 squats to failure. And it's like,
Right.
first of all, there's no way the entire group of those untrained subjects are going to do squats to failure. I mean, basically nobody squats to true failure. That's super, super rare. And then if they did squat to failure, it would have been impossible to do 10 reps, 4 sets in a row. Because if you get 10 the first set, you should be fatigued, and your reps almost invariably go down. There's basically no way you can get the same number of reps, 4 sets in a row, and then say you train to failure. So there's now much more acknowledgement of that fact, and then people talk about volitional failure. And then there are some other definitions. You talk about, say, concentric failure. Usually that's implied in momentary muscle failure because eccentrically people are much stronger than concentrically. So almost nobody fails eccentrically. Like you fail to get the weight up, you don't fail to get the weight down. And then there's technical failure, which is a contentious term because if your technique's good, that normally means that your technique allows you to be as strong as possible. That's part of what good technique is.
Right.
Like if a powerlifter could lift in a different way and then be stronger, they would do it. So in particular for a powerlifter, the best technique is the technique that allows them to lift the most weight. So it's in a well-trained individual, it should be impossible in most cases to have technical failure but not momentary muscle failure, because that would mean your technique's not good. Now in some cases, for different exercises like the front squats, maybe your upper back starts to round, you could say that's technical failure. But then you could also just say that, well, that's momentary muscle failure because you could not complete another rep with good form. So I think technical failure is a bit of a vague term. I've also found in clients that often when you talk about technical failure, they're going to associate it with speed of repetition, or if the movement looked pretty, or range of motion.
Right.
So you have to be very clear, I think, to your clients what you communicate, because, in the end, there are different definitions of failure, and the most important thing is that the other person that you're communicating with, or you yourself, know exactly what you're talking about. But usually, if I'm talking about training to failure, I'm talking about momentary muscle failure.
Totally. And do you think that's the best way to maybe interpret the data in all the types of studies? Like you said, in elderly women that squatted to failure, I mean, they obviously didn't squat it to momentary muscle failure. Perhaps it was positional failure. Do you think this is a good starting point to begin discussing training to failure in regards to hypertrophy?
Yeah, I think mostly it's safer to assume it was volitional failure. In some studies, especially from the sort of HIIT crowd, there are some researchers that are proponents of low volume training and more like Menser, Nautilus kind of style of training. And there you can see that they often specify they had an instructor there that motivated everyone to do as many reps as they could. And they're really focusing on the actual failure. So they really had people fail the repetitions. And then I think we can say, we're as close to momentary muscle failure as we would be ourselves.
Right. And now to begin discussing the training to failure in specific context of hypertrophy, I think we can have two camps: the people in the gyms in the real world that actually train close to the point, that don't see the point in leaving some reps in the tank, and then on the other side, the research that has to standardize training to failure, because it would be really difficult to extrapolate one group doing RAR 3, other group doing RAR whatever. How can we understand this better?
What do you mean by how to understand it better? You mean the difference in opinions?
The difference in opinions, pretty much, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think it's most important to just look at the data. And basically the number one thing that summarizes the data on training to failure is that the total volume is what matters, and whether you train to failure does not. So for muscle growth, there have now been numerous meta-analysis, I think 3 in the last 2 years alone, and we have also done an unofficial one for my PT course in my team, and then we got the same general conclusions. If the repetitions are equal, then it doesn't matter if they train to failure or not, you get the same results. If the repetitions are not equal, they favor the side that did more repetitions, normally. Now, interestingly, training to failure often leads to fewer total repetitions So if you tell people to train to failure and you tell another group to train, say, 1 or 2 reps to failure, then the group training to failure often ends up with a lower total training volume. And I think that's very interesting because it's kind of counterintuitive. They're training harder, but they're getting fewer reps in the end. And it's because training to failure has a disproportionately large effect on your neuromuscular fatigue. So it's very, very fatiguing to hit actual muscle failure, especially because the stimulus to fatigue ratio basically is very poor because you're not even adding a full extra repetition. You're failing it, but you do add a lot of neuromuscular fatigue. So that takes a toll on your work capacity. Work capacity is basically how your reps evolve over time. If your reps go like 10, 10, 10, 10, that's perfect work capacity. In other words, your fatigue index 0. If your reps drop from like 10, 8, 6, 5, then they go from 10 to 5, it will be 50% fatigue index. So training to failure dramatically reduces your work capacity and means your reps go down much faster in subsequent sets than if you hadn't trained to failure. So you get more reps the first set when you train to failure compared to staying a bit away from failure. But then the group training almost to failure, they're going to have a slight decrease in work capacity, and the group training to failure are going to take a nosedive. So when you add up the reps across multiple sets, if you do like 4+ sets per exercise, you get fewer total repetitions on average in most studies in the groups training to failure. So you're actually reducing the stimulus for muscle growth. And in those studies, you see that especially for strength development, but sometimes also for muscle growth, the groups training to failure actually get worse results. So that's a very bad scenario, right? You get more fatigued, you invest more effort, and you're getting worse results. That's a complete no-win scenario. But if you look at studies where they do only 1 set or not a lot of volume, or they just tell people you do either 10 reps or train to failure, and then if they train to failure, they get more reps, then they do better because they can do more repetitions. But then basically the other group's just not training very hard.
Totally. Do you think we can conceptualize it as a means by volume load? Let's say we go to failure, or volume load will be decreasing. But if we leave some reps in the tank, maybe we can even progress through that medium.
Definitely. I think volume load is the best overall marker. Now, you have to get reasonably close to failure. I think 5 reps to failure or so is about the minimum. There are studies, especially in untrained individuals, that show you don't need to be that close. But for an advanced individual, if you're not training within 5 reps to failure, then I think overall, first you need to question your work ethic. But also, I don't think it's time effective. You'd have to do a lot of sets to compensate for that. So, all of this does assume you're getting reasonably close to failure.
Right. But on the other side of the spectrum, what would be the proposed benefits of maybe going to failure from time to time? I think it can be a good coach for repetitions in reserve to actually experience what it means to be in that proximity to failure, but not as a means of training all of the time. Do you think this has value, or maybe it's not necessary to do?
Yes, I think it's in fact vital, because you can't know what 2 reps to failure is if you don't know what failure is. So you basically, de facto, you have to train to failure sometimes to learn what close to failure means. And if you look at the research, you see that many people sometimes dramatically underestimate how many reps they could still do. So there are multiple ways to test this. One is to ask people to estimate it. Either they do 10 reps and then they ask how many reps can you still do, or they estimate it beforehand. And you very commonly see that almost nobody, or almost everybody underestimates how many reps they can do, and basically nobody has the opposite. So basically, most people don't train as hard as they think, and almost nobody trains harder than they think.
Yeah. So I think there's value in training to failure, like you said. And the next topic is a little bit of a segue from that. It's the relationship between training to failure, proximity to failure, better said, and volume, because it will be not the same. Like you have Mike Menzer, you have Dorian Yates, people that train historically with low volumes and pretty much beyond failure. Do you think it's a good strategy to make a relationship between all the volume you're doing and the proximity to failure, and that relationship would be the more volume, the less proximity to failure, the less volume, the more proximity to failure.
Yes, because in the end, it's the total tonnage that matters.
Sure.
That's what we see in research. So you can basically compensate for doing fewer sets by taking those sets closer to failure. To an extent, because as I said, if you have multiple sets, and again, this is why we don't see these type of programs generally, but if you would do, say, 6 sets to failure, then it's very ineffective to train to failure, because it's not an effective way to get more repetitions, because it's good for set 1 and 2 maybe, but then by set 6, you are totally gassed. So, it doesn't even help. That's why I think it makes sense that you see the camps where people do either fewer sets to failure or they do more sets not to failure, because it's ineffective to combine lots of sets with going to failure. You neither get the volume nor the intensity of the work.
Totally. And it just came to my mind. Do you think there's value in I think it was Chris Bertsley, the effective rep model, effective reps, I think it was called. Do you think we can use something like that to better understand the quality of our sets, or maybe not so much?
Yeah, I normally don't really go into other people's specific models, but he blocked me, so no issues in this case.
Don't worry,
because I disagreed with him on some things.
Right.
But I think it's dramatically oversimplified. That's for sure. Greg Knuckles also wrote a good article on it. Right, and my thoughts are very much the same as Greg's, that if you look at the research, this idea that the last 5 reps, that's basically his model, right? The last 5 reps of any set count and the rest don't. So those are the effective reps and the other reps are the ineffective reps. And even as a graduation, the research doesn't confirm this. For one, like I said, there are studies that show people that don't even hit 5 reps to failure still go to get results. I think in one study, they did sets of 7 at 12 RM, and the group doing 4 sets of 7 at 12 RM got the same results as a group doing 3 sets to failure at 12 RM.
Sure.
So by Chris's model, the groups doing 4 sets of 7 at 12 RM, they would, depending on whether you count the 12 rep, they get either 1 effective rep per set, or not even any effective reps per set. So clearly, it's not necessary that you have to be that close to failure, otherwise the set does nothing. And then the next sort of interpretation of the model is, okay, maybe it's not like a strict cutoff, right? It's not like, the set is doing nothing and then it starts doing something.
Sure.
Maybe it's more like there is an increase in the effectiveness of reps, and I think that must be true to some extent based on what we know of motor unit activation. And if you're not having full recruitment yet, the rep cannot be as effective as a rep that does have full recruitment. But if you look at the research on when you get full recruitment of all muscle fibers, that seems to be, based on the latest, I think most accurate model, around 8 reps to failure if you're training seriously. So, and especially if you're training explosively. So you don't need to be, maybe it's more like 8 reps, 8 effective reps per set. But then if it's 8 effective reps, you're always within that realm, basically, right? Unless you're really training like a wuss. So that's then the model basically becomes moot to a large extent. But like I said, the research very clearly shows that it's total training volume that matters, which effectively says every repetition is weighed equally. So there's no evidence at this time that the last reps of a set are more productive than the earlier reps of a set.
So I think volume can be understood, at least I understand it actually, like means to get sufficient exposure to tension, and that volume needs to be close to failure. But that's actually the next question I wanted to ask. And just a little commentary, don't worry, man. I think it's safe to say that sooner or later we all get blocked from somebody for some reason, but no worries there. What is it called? The end point, I think it's called. When is it too many reps from failure? Do you think it's safe to say that perhaps 5? Because it's a lot of discussion here, and I'm also familiar with all the discussion in the mass research review, specifically with Mike Sertus, that he mostly mentions around 5, maybe even 6, and other people, I think it's Greg actually, that says maybe you need less repetitions in reserve?
Yeah, I think in practice you want fewer reps in reserve. I mean, maybe theoretically it's 8 reps to failure. That could still be productive.
8 reps from failure?
Yeah, I mean, then you get full
That's
recruitment and
sure.
yeah. I mean, that's theoretically, I'm saying, right? So you'd have to do a lot of sets, right? You're doing like sets of 6 or 7. I mean, you do like sets of 4 with 12 RM and you'd be doing like 10 sets per exercise. So even if it works, it's very time ineffective, right?
Sure.
And then the next thing is, if you know that it really is your 12 RM, then theoretically, I think that could work, at least for much of your training. I do think you have to take some sets closer to failure to get equal results, especially in the long run. But all of that aside, let's assume it's just 8 reps to failure you have to be, and then you can get results as long as you do enough sets, and you're willing to do more sets than that. The next issue is it really your 12 RM? Because if it happens to be your 14 RM, you are definitely out of the effective zone. So, and we know that most people could probably eke out at least 1 or 2 more repetitions. I think the average, even in well-trained lifters, is 1. So most people can do 1 more rep than they think. Generally, well-trained lifters like powerlifters and stuff.
Yeah.
And if you're already pushing the margin of how close to failure you think you are, and then you're playing with fire in the sense that if you are already underestimating your ability of how hard you can train, and you're already training very far away from failure, then you may be training in a zone where almost nothing happens.
Sure.
And I think especially the individuals that may be inclined to train so far away from failure are the individuals that probably would be most susceptible to these things. And like, make no mistake, and this is why we see that some people just don't get results in the gym. There are many individuals that literally are 10 reps further away from failure than they think. So the difference between volitional and momentary muscle failure for them is like 10 or more repetitions, right? That is a huge freaking spectrum between,
Totally.
That's literally like, that's some people's warm-up set, like a serious trainee's warm-up set. And that's the point where quite some people would say like, yeah, that's, I feel the set's done. So these people really need to be pushed. And if you tell these people like, don't train to failure, then they're going to stay even further away from failure. So some people just need to hear, don't worry about all the fatigue and that stuff. Just do as many reps as you can and train to failure if you hit failure occasionally, or even if you intentionally hit it, that's fine. Like, the most important thing is that you train with high effort, because all of the science aside, I think it is very clear. Anyone who's trained a lot of people, you can see that people that work harder, they get better results on average. So, and I think, like I said, it's especially the people that are that have difficulty not training to failure. Those you could maybe say, okay, yeah, we're staying very far away from failure. We're going to do many sets. But especially the people that may be inclined not to train to failure, those are exactly the people that need to hear, yeah, don't worry about the fatigue. You just need to worry about getting your reps in.
Yeah, I've seen that all the time. The other day, I saw a couple of girls doing hip thrust with like 30 pounds. And I'm like, well, for a hip thrust doing 30 pounds for, let's say, 12, 15 reps, I mean, what stimulus that actually imply? Maybe nothing. And like you said, some people need to be pushed. And if I said to these people, hey, maybe you should leave some reps in the tank, well, it's only make the case worse, right?
Yeah. I mean, some clients, I just say, I skip all of they don't need to worry about reps in reserve and all these complications. Sure. I just tell them train to failure. Like, that's what they need to hear.
Because in the end, and another question that comes from this, the difference between trained people and novice people. Maybe trained people need to gauge better reps in reserve to better progress through time. And maybe novice people need to have that experience with training to failure to begin understanding proximity and all that stuff, right?
Yeah, definitely. Interestingly, though, trained individuals on average in research are barely more accurate than untrained individuals. So it seems to be that it's largely a personality trait difference. And of course, in practice, more trained lifters probably are also more motivated. They are, so they're not just more experienced, but they're also more motivated, which is why they're more experienced. They didn't sign up in January and they stopped in July. So,
sure.
And there are more differences between trained and untrained individuals in practice. But in research, it doesn't seem the case that you get like a lot better at it with practice. There are a few studies that show you do get better at it. And I think, like I said, it's almost de facto necessary that you need to know what failure is. Otherwise, you cannot know what 2 reps to failure is.
Very well.
But, it's not like people really learn to push themselves a lot more. Some people just need more internal stimulus. And in those cases, I think that's why I think it can be more beneficial for some people to hear train to failure rather than try to teach them what 2 reps to failure is.
Totally. Very well. So I think that covers pretty much training to failure, the first aspect of the conversation. I wanted to make the jump to advanced training techniques because I think it can be an interesting topic, but I think it's way more valued than it needs to be. Because for starters, if we know actually that training to failure per se is not a requirement for growth, why would we need strategies to make training beyond failure? Like, let's say, those forced reps that have some people, like 5 to 6 people help you in the squat, stuff like that you see all the time in some Instagram videos and stuff like that. What are the advanced techniques that you consider have the best applicability and also the best evidence that we can back it up and actually imply a benefit in our training?
Yeah, I fully agree with that's also why I often discuss training to failure when talking about advanced techniques. Because once you understand training to failure, you already know that you don't even need to bother with forced reps or any of the multitude of advanced techniques that have you training to failure. Drop sets, I'm also not a fan of. In fact, it's good to know that when you do forced reps, there's specific research on this, the muscle activation level of your set goes down, which makes perfect sense because as soon as you've hit failure, you've exhausted all your motor units. All of your muscle fibers they've done what they can. They've exerted themselves to the maximum. That's why you're now failing. And after that, there's just more fatigue. So you're just going to have motor units that are dropping out. Muscle fibers are fatigued. They're damaged. They can't fire anymore. And you're not getting any additional stimulus anymore. All you're getting is less and less. But the fatigue keeps racking up. So in terms of techniques that make more sense, you're looking at techniques that don't involve training to failure, typically. Now, there are a few very useful ones that are that have research backing, and that's eccentric overloading, katsu, or blood flow restriction training,
right?
Cluster sets. I think those 3 are probably my favorites. And then post-activation potentiation or post-activation performance enhancement. They're sort of the same thing, depending on who you ask, is another useful one. It's a little bit more niche.
Very well. Do you think we can discuss a little bit of clusters in regards to the Vargas Molina research? That I think it's a couple of studies, right? Like 2 studies about that. Do you think it has some applicability? Because to me, they're a little confusing, but nonetheless, I find it really interesting to apply in our training.
I think the main thing with cluster sets is that mechanistically what you're doing is you are trading metabolic stress for an increase in force output.
Right.
And because you're resting in between reps, or cluster set is when you do a few repetitions or even just 1 repetition, and then you rest a little bit. So you don't just rest in between your sets, but you also rest in between a set. You do say 3 reps, and that's in a cluster. You rest a little bit, and you do 3 more reps, rest a little bit, 3 more reps, and maybe then you're done. That would be a cluster set. And those rest intervals within the set, what they accomplish is that metabolic stress dissipates rather quickly. It doesn't need a lot of rest. That's also why you recover quite quickly from high rep sets compared to low rep sets.
Sure.
Now, this decrease in metabolic stress also means that you need more reps to get the same effective stimulus, because metabolic stress lowers the activation threshold of high threshold motor units. So it's beneficial indirectly, not directly for muscle growth, but indirectly, because it forces your body to recruit the higher threshold motor units, the bigger muscle fibers, the type 2 fibers that have the most growth potential. So yeah, you need to do more repetitions, and you can do more repetitions. And in the end, most research finds that for muscle growth, that balances out. So whether you do a set of 10 repetitions at 10 RM in one go, or whether you take a rest interval in between and then you end up with 12 repetitions, you get the same effect. But there is some research that indicates it's better for strength development, and there is quite a lot of research it's better for power development to have the cluster set because you have higher quality of work. And I think that's very interesting because, I mean, at least power is not something most people that do strength training are particularly concerned in, but for athletes, it's definitely relevant. And I mean, better power over the long run may benefit strength development, and then strength development in turn over the long run may benefit muscle growth. So I think it's a very promising technique, but it hasn't really panned out. As you say, like the latest reviews all find general null effects. And you do have to do the extra work. If you're doing the same volume as otherwise, you're getting worse results, which I think makes sense because, if you can do a set of 10 in one go, but then you take a rest in between, you're effectively doing 2 very easy sets of 5. So you're just not training very hard.
Right. And I think most advanced techniques kind of end up like that, at least with what we know up to date.
Mm-hmm.
They seem promising, they seem interesting, but panning out in the research and in our own training, it's a different whole story, right?
Yeah, and they're very niche. There are many techniques that are that have some use. Like, I mean, for athletes, I think cluster sets are very good. Like concurrent athletes, maybe volleyball players, tennis players that needs power. Then it's great. Olympic weightlifters, I think they're very useful. So, but yeah, if someone's just interested in getting jacked, then yeah, it's not really necessary.
Traditional sets all the way. Keep it simple, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
It's not as boring, but it's what works and what we want our gains, not some really crazy sexy workout, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, eccentric overloading is the only one I'd say where that's beneficial also for muscle growth. I mean, it's not really a difference from a straight set. It's just a different way to train, but because you're still doing a straight set potentially. But eccentric overloading, I think, actually also makes a lot of theoretical sense because, as we touched on earlier, muscles are stronger during eccentric muscle contractions, at least 20%, so it's a substantial difference. And with eccentric overloading, basically what you're doing is you're increasing the force during the eccentric, so you're making the muscle work harder during the eccentric, and it can work harder. So at the minimum, it's a very effective way to get the internal work done by the muscle just to get your volume in. Like you're just... a normal set never takes full advantage of our internal ability to contract the muscle tissue to produce force, because the concentric is always difficult, but the eccentric is always at least 20% away from failure, essentially. So eccentric overloading just matches better with our muscle's ability to produce force, and it's the ability to produce force that puts tension on the muscle fibers, and it's the tension on the muscle fibers that causes the growth.
Sure.
And we do see in research there is a trend in numerous areas that eccentric overloading tends to produce better gains on a set-by-set basis than regular training.
But I wanted to ask you actually about eccentric overload training. We do need specialized equipment for that one, right? Because I'm sorry to interrupt.
It would be nice.
Just not to confuse it with eccentric accentuating, like counting 5 seconds on the eccentric. They're different things, right?
Yes. Just slowing down the eccentric does not constitute eccentric overloading because the load is not higher during the eccentric. It's the same load, just lifted more slowly.
Right.
Now, that's a bit of a different topic that might also have some benefits. At least you have to lower it under control, but it doesn't have to be super fast based on most research or too super slow. But eccentric overloading actually involves increasing the amount of force production, not just lifting it more slowly or more controlled or whatever, but it means that there's actually more force production from the muscle tissue during the eccentric. Now, ideally, and the traditional way to implement this is you, for example, have a leg extension machine, and it has, 200 Newton force, whatever, or a certain amount of weight that you have to lift during the concentric. So you kick up the leg, and the resistance is 70 kilo or whatever. And then as soon as you hit the top, there's a simple mechanism would be there's just a switch, and it adds 20 kilos to the resistance. So now when you're lowering the weight, you're suddenly lowering 90 kilos instead of 70. And that's true eccentric overloading. When you do that, you'll feel that every set, every repetition is so much more effortful than a normal set. Because normally, effectively, what you're doing is you're producing you have maximal intent to produce force during the concentric, and you're kind of relaxing during the eccentric, even if you're controlling it with, if you're controlling the descent, it's still, much easier. But effectively, what happens during eccentric overloading is that you're still trying to push maximally, but the weight's just pushing you down during eccentric overloading. So it's like you're constantly pushing at maximal effort. And indeed, that is what's happening. So then you constantly have maximal force production from muscles, every repetition during the concentric and the eccentric. Now, if you have special machines, that's great. But if you don't, there are still some ways you can implement it. And my favorite one generally is to use momentum. So, for example, during a calf jump, which is an exercise I've written about and published, I think there's one other person that used the name calf jumps for something else, annoyingly. But a calf jump is basically where you sort of cheat yourself up to lockout during a calf race using essentially the quads. So you have a little bit of squat in there, but then you lower yourself under control. Effectively, what you're doing is you're using the quads to aid you during the concentric, so you can produce more force. But then the quads don't help you during the eccentric, which means the calves have now to lower the weight on their own. So the calves actually get eccentric overloading without needing to increase the amount of resistance. So you don't need special machines. You just need to use momentum during the concentric. And by virtue of, just by the nature of momentum, you cannot use it during the eccentric. You can also do this during a pull down, which is why I actually favor people doing pull downs with momentum, because you can pull the weight down and you lean back. Now, of course, you don't lean like all the way back. You still use good technique and full range of motion, but you can lean back and effectively use the erectors and the hips to generate a bit of extra force, and then you control the eccentric with purely your back and your arms. So you get eccentric overloading, again, without needing to change the resistance of the cable.
And I think it's really interesting because the eccentric slowing down intentionally, it results in less force production. And people go under this term of, what is it called? I think it's something about tempo. I'm sorry, I forgot the term, but it's actually less force production when you intentionally slow down on the opposite side of what you're actually speaking about, which is making the eccentric harder. Not by intentionally slowing, but by having more external load.
Yeah, and the resistance is the same. So that's the main thing. Like just doing it more slowly is the same as doing a concentric, essentially. A little bit worse, potentially. The important thing is that it doesn't require an increase in force production. And it's the force production, that's the mechanical tension. So indeed, tempo is very different from changing the amount of force required to lift the weight or lower it.
Time under tension. I'm sorry. It just came to my mind. It was time under tension. Menno,
All right.
The next one, I think it can be interesting for some people, is the blood flow restriction training, KAATSU, as it's also known. And I think it's interesting in maybe injury situations, maybe when you don't have the equipment. I used to use that one when the pandemic just started and I had limited equipment. So I had my bands and man, did it hurt? But I think it's interesting. I think it can have a place in our own training. And can we talk a little bit about that one?
Yeah, it's particularly useful during the pandemic and with bodyweight exercises, because effectively KAATSU training or blood flow restriction training allows you to make a lightweight function like a heavier weight. And the main applications there are, of course, that A, if you don't have heavy enough weights, and B, when you're injured, then it's extremely desirable, or even when you just have weak body parts, like I have weak elbows, so I quite often use KAATSU for my arm training. My knees are also not great, so I also use KAATSU for leg presses, for example. I love KAATSU leg presses. It's the same principle we touched on earlier. It's sort of the opposite of cluster sets, you could say, because you're increasing the metabolic stress, at the expense for lower force output, as in total force output, because the blood flow restriction and the metabolic stress mean you cannot do as many reps with a weight as you could do without it. If you do, 100 kilograms and you do squats with the blood flow restriction, then you cannot do as many reps, assuming you can do more than 8 normally, as you could do without the blood flow restriction. I think it makes perfect intuitive sense. You just have a lot more metabolic stress with the reps on. And it's not inherently beneficial because metabolic stress is not a growth pathway, in contrast to what a lot of research early seemed to or potentially suggested. But like I said, it's just a very practical way to train with low weights and still make them very effective for muscle growth, because the metabolic stress compensates for the very low weight. So you can just use 30% of 1RM, or you can do sets of 30. That's commonly done in research. And with blood flow restriction, you really don't need heavy weights to do 30 reps. Many people, almost everyone that I've used it with, they still overestimate how much weight they can lift. If I tell them like 30 reps with the Katsu, and they're like, oh yeah, normally I do this, so I'm going to use 40 kilos. And it's like, nope, it's going to be maybe 20.
Sure, and boy, does it hurt, man. I remember my arms going like,
Yeah, it shouldn't be ultra painful. You shouldn't get bruising and tingling and the like. But yeah, there's a lot of research showing it hurts more. And especially Katsu calf training. Oh boy, that's...
Also, I also did it, man.
Katsu calf training is... I think that's the only type of exercise where I'm tempted to wuss out from the sheer pain.
But at the end of the day, we're gym rats. We love it. We live for the pain. To the gains, brother. But I think one of the disadvantages of Katsu training is that you can only do it for your extremities. You couldn't do Katsu training for the pecs. You couldn't do it for the glutes, because I've seen in the gym people that put their bands to train their glutes, which I find it really kind of why are you doing that?
Yeah, I mean, you can use it for the glutes, but it has to be an exercise where the limb is still a limiting factor. Right. So it's very interesting. You can do it for squats, for example, and then it also benefits the glutes because it makes essentially the whole exercise more difficult. It's quite counterintuitive, but it's one of the more, it's been replicated now a few times, that if you do Katsu squats, then it's not just the quads that grow more if you use very low weights, but also the glutes. And like I said, it's because you're essentially making the whole exercise more difficult, and different muscle groups can compensate for each other to at least some extent. But if you're just doing hip abductions or glute isolation exercise, then as you say, it makes no sense because you're not occluding the glutes. So if it's not the legs that are a limiting factor, then the exercise is not actually becoming more difficult. It's just a nice way to, I guess for many people, the reps are kind of what most bands do nowadays. They highlight your glutes, sort of a push-up effect for the glutes. So maybe that's the reason you see it.
I think that would be the explanation behind that. So almost to finish off, because as always, I want to be respectful of your time, Menno. Can we talk a little bit PAP, post-activation potentiation, and its application to hypertrophy training?
Post-activation potentiation and post-activation performance enhancement are terms that are strictly scientifically usually PAP, so post-activation potentiation, is used for like a minute and in certain contexts, and then the PAP-E, performance enhancement, is used for the longer term effect. Many researchers just use the same term, post-activation potentiation, for the whole thing, because, I mean, it is potentiation after activation, so it's still logical to use the same term. And that's also what it means. It means that after a certain amount of activation, in particular a very high amount of muscle activation, there is a potentiating, so an increase in muscle activity and force production afterwards. And in particular, it's actual active force production. It means that after very high levels of muscle activation, the rate of cross-bridge formation is increased. So it's sort of like it's just a physical effect, but it means that the muscle sort of is primed to contract more strongly. So the cross bridges that make a muscle contract the sliding filaments. It's when you flex your biceps, the actin myosin filaments are sliding over each other. That's the muscle contraction, and that those cross bridges are formed very rapidly. So it's not like it's a slow thing. It's like super rapidly. So it's almost continuous, and it can go even faster if the muscle has just experienced very high levels of contraction. So it just did a very powerful contraction, like a 1RM. And afterwards, you're stronger. So in research, like practical application, if you do a 1RM squat and then you wait the right amount of time, then you can actually do more repetitions with, say, 70% of your 1RM as you could do if you hadn't done the 1RM. Now, it only works down. So the intensity has to be lower of the next work than the first work you did. Basically, the first work has to be 85% of 1RM or more intense to be successful. Doesn't have to be a 1RM, but it should be, pretty close. And then the next set should be 80% of 1RM or lighter. And then you can do more reps. Now that should be beneficial because you can do more volume. The question is it worth doing a 1RM for? Well, if you're a powerlifter and you're doing a 1RM anyway, then I think you might as well take advantage of it and do sort of a back-off set on steroids with post-activation potentiation. And I think for bodybuilders, it can also be useful sometimes, like very advanced level bodybuilders, because at a certain level of strength development, you basically stop gaining unless you're doing very high intensity work. Like if you're not doing sets of 5 or lower, you're just going to stop gaining strength at some point. So by doing a 1RM, even if it's like a single with 90% of 1RM, you get a bit of extra strength work that allows you to implement progressive overload and maybe keep gaining strength. And then afterwards, maybe a minute later, you can do the back off set with, say, 80 or 70% of 1RM, and you're stronger. So the 1RM has a dual function, and it's not as injurious. And you can even do that twice, and you have basically wave loading, you could call it, where you do a single with a 90% of 1RM. 1 minute later, or you basically immediately strip off some plates so that you're at 80 or 70% of 1RM. You wrap out, you take at least 5 minutes rest, you do another single with 90% of 1RM, strip off the plates again, and keep wrapping out. And then you have a workout that provides a very good balance between strength and size gains.
Very well. Did you mean with literal steroids, Menno?
No. You can also do it with steroids.
I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can do more. But I think in the PAP application, I think it's worth considering the trade-off of time and effort, because it's not easy to warm up for a 1RM. The time you have to spend afterwards for your, let's say, working sets, it tends to make your workout quite longer, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a practical technique. It's definitely an advanced technique in every sense of the word, because you need to strip off plates a few times. Sure. You need to lift very heavy. So, there's more potential for injury. Your technique has to be good. You have to time your rest interval, because you have to also figure out when you respond best. Usually it's 1 and 5 minutes after the near maximal effort that performance tends to peak. At 1 minute, you get the highest increase in actual post-activation potentiation, but then there's also still fatigue from the set. And at 5 minutes, it seems that there's still some potentiating effect, but the fatigue from the set's largely gone, so you have another relatively spike moment.
Very well.
Where basically the net potentiation is greater than the fatigue.
Right. So to finish off, Menno, do you think, besides the ones that we already discussed, are there any advanced techniques that you think are worth considering, worth trying? Maybe myo reps, maybe another one that is currently escaping my mind. Do you think there's another one that we might find it useful?
Off the top of my head, it would be one I haven't used in a long time. Myo reps is probably the closest one, the first one I would mention, but it's basically completely understudied. So there's there's simply no research on it. So for most purposes, I prefer Katsu or just straight sets. I think my reps might be time effective, but the thing is you're chartering in unknown territory, so it's hard to say at this point. And then there are some techniques that, they have some application. For example, if someone trains twice a week, then all of this stuff about stimulus to fatigue ratio goes right out the window. Like it doesn't matter how much fatigue, you accumulate because you train twice a week. So of course you're going to recover.
Go nuts.
So yeah, exactly. and if someone says, I train twice a week and I have 60 minutes, then I'm like, yep, drop sets, go for it. Train to failure, go for it. You know, you have 60 minutes, just do as much as you can. So, you know, there are some niche scenarios and it depends on the context, but I think the ones we talked about are the main ones that are useful for serious trainees, and that you should know because they have actual application. You'll encounter scenarios where you may want to use them and they provide a tangible advantage compared to straight sets.
Awesome. So I think that covers it. I wanted to thank you again for taking the time. I really do appreciate it. I'll be posting this conversation so people can watch it anytime on my Instagram profile. Also, make sure to tag your PT course.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's
my pleasure.
It's terrific. It's a really comprehensive course. And I don't know if anything else you wanted to add in the discussion of whether training to failure or advanced techniques.
No, I think we're good. And I'll be sure to share it. It was nice talking to you as usual.
Awesome, Menno. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Hope to talk to you soon.
All right. See you.
See you.